Excellent. Well, good afternoon, everyone. I'm State Senator Jamie Eldridge, the Senate Chair of the Criminal Justice Reform Caucus. Very proud to be here with Representative Mary Keefe, the House Chair, and thanks so much to Senator Cindy Creem and Representative China Tyler as the authors of the No Cost Calls for Incarcerated People legislation, Senate 1559, House 1900. This has been a top priority for the Criminal Justice Reform Caucus last session and, of course, this session. And I would just say, as someone that has recently been to both the state prison, to Susan Baranowski maximum security facility, and a county facility, the Worcester County House of Corrections, on Friday, when you take the tour, when you sit with incarcerated people, you hear almost immediately about the burden of people being able to make calls, the impact it has not only on the incarcerated people, but often their loved ones. And, talking to the sheriffs or the superintendents is just the amount of money that often comes into those facilities. And that's just, I think, not a sound setup. I think it's time to abolish these calls, and really appreciate Senator Creem and Representative Tyler for filing this legislation, as well as the incredible advocacy by Prisoners Legal Services, including Bonnie Tenorello. So with that, I now want to hand it off to my co-chair, Representative Mary Keefe, and the two of us were just at the Worcester County House of Corrections, where you saw the telephones, or also the video machines now that are really quite expensive for any incarcerated person or their loved ones. So we know there's a problem and we need to address it. So Representative Keefe.
Thank you to Senator Eldridge. Hi, everybody, and thank you all for being here. So I'm noticing we have 88 participants and probably a few more coming in. We just finished a formal session over on the House side, and farewell to Claire Cronin, who's going to be the new ambassador to Ireland. So it's very exciting. I wanted to just say, as Jamie said, or Senator Eldridge said, that yes, and if having the opportunity to visit, we've seen all kinds of what would you say, very functioning, but dysfunctioning modes of communication that families have to use to talk to loved ones in visiting, but also to be able to call and make those phone calls. We know that almost every aspect of being incarcerated has a price that goes with it, whether it's looking for a toothbrush or some basic snacks or food, and to making those phone calls to your loved ones, to receiving money from your loved ones. It used to be that you could, your family could come visit and also give you money in a appointed box, and now it has to be routed through a third party, which takes a piece of that money as well. So the families are a lifeline to all of our incarcerated brothers and sisters, and without communication and contact, we know it's a much harder, harsher time for them. And so I want to thank also Senator Creem and Representative Tyler for filing this bill, and for everybody that's going to contribute here today. We have a number of people that are going to be speaking. We have Leslie Credle from Justice.
So he said that to who? Whitney?
Sorry?
To Trisha.
Keep going, Rep Keefe. Representative, now you're on mute.
Sorry, I have a number of speakers. Nia Reid-Patterson, who's an impacted family member, and then Bianca Tylek, Executive Director of Worth Rises. So with that, I'd like to turn it over to Senator Creem and Representative Tyler to just talk about why this bill is so important.
On mute. I'm happy to go first, but Representative Tyler, did you have to rush off to vote or something?
We just took our last vote, so you can go ahead.
Okay, want to just make sure you don't miss that important vote. So I'm actually thrilled to have filed this bill. I will say, as someone who spent a lot of their life working in the area of family law, representing people in parents in custody battles, representing parents in divorce, I know how important the stability of a family is. I know how important it is to children that they have contact with parents, both parents. And so, although I don't want to take away from how important it is for those incarcerated to be able to connect with their family, I do want to make a point of how important it is to other family members to be able to keep their contacts with those incarcerated, spouses, children, sometimes nieces and nephews that look up to those people. And the nuclear family, staying together, keeping together, is so important. So here we're making it harder instead of easier. We keep talking about families, how children should rely on parents and be close. And then when we're incarcerated, we make it harder. We change the dynamics. That makes absolutely no sense to me. So the Senate bill would allow incarcerated people to make telephone calls free of cost. The cost to the prisons is so small. The cost to the sheriffs is actually so small. And we're trying to make money on those people incarcerated. That's punishment on top of punishment. It's exorbitantly expensive for people who are incarcerated to call their loved ones. For many, the cost of those calls can drive the family into debt. And if the family has any money, particularly where it might be a parent that's been a wage earner who's incarcerated, instead of keeping that family intact, we're going to take more from that family to keep them together. It just makes no sense to me. The high cost of calls can keep incarcerated parents from connecting with their children in one only way available to them. And families with loved ones who are incarcerated are disproportionately those with the least resources to shoulder these additional financial burdens. Countless studies have found how important these strong connections are with loved ones. It's important to note that these calls do not need to be this expensive. One of the reasons the fees are so high is because companies offering these services are providing prisoners in jails a commission, providing the sheriff or the jails a commission for subscription, which is the reason for the additional fees. There's no reason for that. And if the company can get the money, they charge the money. And the fact that we don't know how to trace it, the fact that in many instances, sheriffs tell us they're using these funds for programs. What programs? We don't even know what programs they're using them from. So making these calls free would create an incentive for the Department of Correction to negotiate a better rate with suppliers, because the rates would no longer be subsidized by the incarcerated. So they would have to negotiate a good deal. And we're not the first one to make this change. Connecticut recently became the first state to eliminate fees for all prison calls. And in the municipal level, New York City, San Francisco, San Diego County have all successfully waived these fees. It's time to help those incarcerated and end this regressive tax on phone calls. So thank you very much. I wanted to introduce Bonnie Tiarello, the staff attorney at Prisoner Legal Services, but I think first, my partner in crime here, you might say, Representative Tyler, it's a pleasure, and I'm so thrilled to have filed this and work with you. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Madam Leader, and a partner in good crime, we would say. So good afternoon, everyone. I feel like I know many folks on the call, but for those I don't know, I look forward to meeting you and working with you soon. I am State Representative China Tyler, the Vice Chair of the Judiciary Committee in the House. And I also too happen to be the chairwoman of the Massachusetts Black and Latino Caucus. And I'm so proud to be here today. I want to start off with a huge thank you to my colleagues in the Criminal Justice Reform Caucus, all of you. Special shout out to Senator Eldridge and Representative Keefe for chairing this fight for justice with the Criminal Justice Caucus. And I also too wanted to thank Bianca Tylek. She's amazing, and the work that you have done here has been amazing. To Prisoners Legal Services, you guys are amazing, and we really appreciate your partnership. And to Miss Reid, who will be speaking a little bit later, we appreciate you being on these calls with all that you have sacrificed in your own home. So a little bit about me. I've worked this issue topic of just prison reform in general is very near and dear to me. I grew up with a household full of men who were all at one point in their lives incarcerated, and so know firsthand how this feels to a family. And upon graduating college, I spent my first couple of years working at a pre-release center, helping those that were nearing release get employment, housing, and community support. And so I'm here today before you as state rep, and it is my honor to be able to push this bill forward. And for the second year in a row, I've had the true honor of leading the charge alongside my Senate co-sponsor here, Leader Creem, to pass House Bill 1900/Senate 1559, titled An Act Relative to Telephone Services for Inmates in All Correctional and Other Penal Institutions in the Commonwealth. When someone is incarcerated, believe it or not, it is extremely expensive, as we all know, to maintain health and wellness behind the walls. And one of my biggest expenses, and one of the biggest expenses folks take on, is to have to keep in touch with their family who is their support systems. So passing this bill will allow for those who happen to be incarcerated to make phone calls, video calls, email services free of charge in any detention center here in the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. And it really just does boggle me to see how a company like Securus is able to charge for a free email anyways. It's just really mind-boggling. This is extremely important because going home is a reality for everyone, and we cannot afford to put more barriers in place from preventing them from having the real second chance at success upon release. And we'll get into the numbers more, and I'm sure Bianca will give a very amazing brief, as she's done me very many times, on the cost here. But on average, Massachusetts residents who are our families, many who are low income, are charged about 21 cents per minute or so, for a total of $3.15 for a maximum of a 15-minute call to speak to a loved one who is incarcerated. And in Massachusetts, we spend annually about $16.8 million on phone calls to our loved ones who happen to be incarcerated. Long story short, folks, it's more than your cell phone bill. So this situation is nearly impossible to afford when we know that inmates make well under $1 per hour while working in the jail. So not only can inmates not afford it, but the rates are so inconsistent across many institutions, and they continue to increase at the expense of families who are just trying to support their loved ones while incarcerated. So rather than making a pathway home more difficult for folks, we need to ensure that going home is a real reality. So this matter is unfair to families in the Commonwealth of Massachusetts, and they shouldn't be taken advantage of and forced to carry this heavy financial burden. So making phone calls will help lower recidivism rates and help establish a more successful reentry for those incarcerated currently. So in closing, I'd just like to say thank you all, and we are well on our way to making this happen. We have many partners who were very interesting partners in this space, including the Department of Corrections and sheriffs are at the table and were engaging with us. And we will keep pushing to ensure that phone calls are not another barrier to folks actually going home on a good foot. Everyone deserves to have a clean slate after they serve their time. But here in Massachusetts right now with these telephone calls, it's just not the case. And with that, I urge you to support House Bill 1900 and our Senate counterpart bill. And please make sure you call your state rep and your senator and ensure that they are educated about the bill. If you have questions or need more specifics on what this bill actually means, you can feel free to reach out to any of the partners here, and we'll be more than happy to get you beefed up and versed on specific issue topics that you can speak with your electeds about, and make sure that they are signed on to the bill, because the more that we have support in the forefront, the more likely it is to pass. So I want to say thank you all for your commitment to our incarcerated community, and please know that I'm committed alongside Senator Creem to helping champion this bill. And we look forward to hopefully passing this bill this year in the legislature in the 192nd session. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you so much, Senator Creem and Representative Tyler. We could not ask for better champions of this basic basic human need, communication between incarcerated people and their loved ones. Much appreciation for your leadership. And thank you so much to Senator Eldridge and Representative Keefe and to their staff, Afnan, Nela, and Kelsey Road for organizing this. And thank you to the 119 and counting people that are standing with us and with incarcerated people and their loved ones in our communities right now on this Zoom, showing your concern for this most basic need, communication. As you're going to hear, it won't cost much and the benefits are tremendous. So what we're going to do now is show you a very short film that was produced thanks in large part to our first speaker, Leslie Credle. Before Leslie speaks and before I introduce her as a leader of our coalition that has been working to pass this legislation, I'm going to let you see this film. And the women in the film speak very eloquently about the burdens of paying for prison phone calls and the importance of nurturing family ties. So I'm going to say no more and then introduce our panel after.
Department of Corrections. This call is not private. It will be recorded and may be monitored. To accept this free call, press 1. You may start the conversation now.
People don't know how hard it is in prison unless you step foot in there. You know what I mean? Because I have a cousin that's doing natural life in prison. And I used to ignore his phone calls. I used to ignore his letters. And if I knew then what I know now, I would have never done that. Because now I feel I can not just empathize, but sympathize with everything he's going through.
You want to be able to keep in contact with people on the outside, people that care about you and that matter in your life, and just not be surrounded by these cops that are looking down on you and discriminating you every day and just treating you like shit.
A lot of us that we're in there, we go through a really bad depression when we're in there. Like a lot of us too, like my mom is quadriplegic, and when I was in there, like I needed those phone calls, you know.
For me, like that, when I've been in so long, I get detached and I get cold. So if I didn't have anybody on the outside to talk to, then, you know, I'd become isolated.
You need to be in touch with your family and parenting from behind the wall, and which is hard, and you need to be in touch with your children.
I was doing natural life in prison, and so phone calls to my family members, my son, who was 3 when I left and got incarcerated, was very important to me because I had to watch him grow through the phone and the visits and things of that nature. To have to pay a bill outstanding the way my grandmother at the time, God rest her soul, she had to pay was devastating to her as an elderly person.
It takes a lot of your money. The first minute is $1 something, and the next minute is 10 cents, and it goes on from there.
For me to call my family, it cost me over $3 a phone call. You know what I mean? And it's like now me and my family are ending up spending $400 or $500 a month, probably sometimes more, on the phone to keep in contact. Believe it or not, it puts a stress on relationships with other people when you call them and they don't have the money. They want to talk to you, but they can't afford it. It's just a burden. When I call, I know for a fact that when I call my father, he's like, "Oh, here we go again. How much is this going to cost me? I can't afford this." Of course, he wants to talk to me.
Back in 2017, I was told about my father passing away. At that particular time, I did not have funds on the phone, and the officer decided to give me 5 minutes a call. It was very, very difficult, very emotionally difficult to be able to talk to my loved ones in front of this officer about my father's passing. It is very difficult for a person such as myself who is serving a life without parole to maintain funds in order to be able to speak to my loved ones.
I know a girl right now that just for her to call, because she have 2 baby sisters, to call one of them just to know how they doing, she has to pick whether she wants deodorant, toothpaste, or a phone call. So I just recently talked to her baby sister, and so many heinous crime happened to her sister. And she can't even know about it because it's hard for her to talk to them because she doesn't have the money.
Oh my God, you can have more phone calls. You will be more connected to the outside world. So that will help out a lot.
And then there's people that don't have anybody to give them money or to help, pay for phone calls. And if no one knows where they are, you know what I mean? Like, you can just call and it's free, so you can let somebody know, where you are in case someone's looking for you.
You will have a better bond with your children. You'll be able to formulate a better relationship with your family. You'll be a sense of relief. You'll have better energy. You'll be more focused. Your life will be so much better on the inside. You'll have a weight off your chest.
Thank you, Leslie and others who worked on that very powerful film. I'm gonna introduce our three panelists each before they speak. You can put your questions in the chat, and staff is going to be monitoring the chat, and we will get to the questions after all the speakers have spoken. We should have plenty of time for questions, so please put them in the chat and we'll try to get to all of them after our speakers. And Leslie Credle, who is the Executive Director of Justice for Housing and a leader in the Keep Families Connected coalition that has been working for these no-cost calls, will be our first speaker. She was released from federal prison in 2018. Her lived experience led her to champion this legislation and to challenge the incarceration of women and girls. Since her release, she's been on a mission to dismantle the carceral system and end incarceration for women and girls. And she has been a passionate advocate for eliminating the barrier of telephone charges. So I'm going to ask Leslie to speak first.
Thank you, Bonnie. Good afternoon. I just want to thank Senator Creem and Rep. Tyler for their heartfelt testimony today. And this bill is personal to me, and your support is appreciated. I really appreciate it. As you can see from the film, that it's emotional, right, for folks who are incarcerated. That connection to their families is really important when you're in there. I've been working on this bill for over 2 years now. Our organization receives numerous requests for telephone support from families who have loved ones who are incarcerated, as well as incarcerated individuals who are, trying to make calls to prepare for their parole hearings, or trying to make phone calls to prepare for release. There's a lot of financial expenses when you're released from prison, and if we could save that revenue for, housing, or you get your ID, reentry is very important part of keeping the community safe, having successful reentry. So if families can use that money instead of spending it on phone weekly, monthly. My family spent over $500 a month when I was incarcerated. I was the primary caretaker of my family. And they lost that source of revenue. It was a difficult time for them. It was traumatic for my 76-year-old mother who struggled so that my children were able to speak to me. It was important for them to stay connected to their mom, right? You worry more about your children when you're separated and unable to get to them. And there's nothing more traumatic for a child when a parent is arrested and goes to prison. Even as teenagers, it's scary for them. It was difficult to watch what they went through, feeling abandoned, left to their own devices. I lived that. I know a lot of families whose lives has been impacted by someone who's in prison, right? Or somebody who's still in prison. And people may say, oh, we put ourselves there, or we did it to ourselves. As legislators, I know you hear both sides. I experienced both sides too. I also was a victim of the worst crime. You know, someone took my child's life, and I live that pain every day. There's not a day to go by that I don't grieve for my daughter, Brianna. I could easily choose to remain angry and hold on to that. But in order for me to heal and for our community to heal, and sometimes you have to sacrifice yourself to allow other mothers, other fathers, other grandmothers, other sons, other daughters, other families to communicate with their loved ones who are still here in the flesh. They still can communicate with them. Despite their transgressions, their families still love them. They still yearn for them. They may be behind bars, but they're still able to communicate. So why would I take that opportunity away from someone else? Why would any of us want that? So I would just respectfully, want this bill to give families some relief who have their loved ones, because it's very important to stay connected to their loved ones who are still here today. Thank you, Bonnie, and thank you, everybody, for allowing me to speak today.
Many thanks, Leslie, for sharing so powerfully and so honestly with all of us here today. Really appreciate that. And next up, we have another woman who's also directly affected by all the barriers to communication with people who are incarcerated. Nia Reid-Patterson, she's a mother, she's an educator. She and her husband, Mr. Alameen, have a 10-year-old, her husband Alameen have a 10-year-old son together. And Alameen is a dedicated and active father to their son. But as she will discuss, Nia continues to struggle with the high cost of calls. Nia, thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Bonnie. Good afternoon. My name is Nia Reid-Patterson. Thank you for giving me your time to hear my story. So as Bonnie mentioned, my husband is currently incarcerated at MCI in Norfolk. I know many of you have had the pleasure of doing work with him in the AECC. We have a 10-year-old son, Tank, and over the last 10 years, my husband and I have done our best to raise our son and ensure he has what some would classify as a regular or normal life any 10-year-old kid could have. In spite of his prison sentence, my husband has been an active parent throughout our son's life. Our society will lead you all to believe that a person who is incarcerated is no longer a parent and does not uphold their obligations to their children. This couldn't be any further from the truth. Although we only receive 20-minute calls, my husband has been active in participating in parent conferences, family therapy sessions, and school awards all through our time on our calls. Our son is in 5th grade now, and my husband has yet to miss a parent conference. Prior to COVID, my son would bring his homework to the prison, and my husband would help him with his schoolwork and his Sunday schoolwork. And even though visits have no longer been in contact, my husband continues to call throughout the week to ensure our son continues to be successful in his educational career. Once a week on Saturday evenings, we have our family night. During these calls, we gain a deeper understanding of our religion, Islam. We complete projects such as our family vision board and ensure we are living up to our family goals. I met my husband 24 years ago when I was just 12 years old, and today we've been married for 6 years. As one can imagine, maintaining a healthy marriage with someone who is incarcerated isn't easy at all. We are dealing with unnecessary trauma caused by the DOC on a daily basis. We have to navigate the financial strains and hardships that are placed on a family when one income is removed from the household. We provide steady emotional support not only to each other, but also to our son. As I stated before, we have participated in family therapy sessions during these 20-minute phone calls because it is important to both of us as parents that we are maintaining good mental health. The harm caused by us living through this prison sentence my husband is serving has been detrimental to our well-being. And as you know, the DOC does not provide any adequate mental wellness to people in their custody, and they certainly don't offer any kind of mental wellness supports for a family unit. The calls used for family therapy, as well as the other calls we are using, are crucial for our family unit to stay intact. It's been almost 2 years since full in-person visits have been happening, and the lack of physical contact and quality time together has done nothing but cause more harm to our family and other families. We have access to video visits, as you know. However, we have to pay $5.31 for a 20-minute video visit. This is often faced with laggy connection and instability on the facility's end. We are only allowed 2 20-minute video visits per week, leaving my son and me to split that time. Can you imagine only being able to see your spouse and your child for 40 minutes a week? The DOC announced to legislators that contact visits have resumed. However, what they did not say was that these contact visits are only 1 hour long behind plexiglass. You have to call and schedule the visits at least 24 hours in advance. Then you have to wear your mask, and your seat is a few feet away from that plexiglass. Just recently, the DOC announced that we are allowed a brief 30-second hug at the start of the visit, and we have to be at the visits at least 30 minutes in advance. And now they're requiring us to be there at least 50 minutes due to COVID testing. And even with negative tests, we have to remain behind the plexiglass. So as you can imagine, this is no place for a child to visit. Without any oversight and accountability, DOC will continue to leave this plexiglass up for as long as possible. So calls have always been a necessity, and right now more than ever, we need them, and we need legislators to do what's morally right and pass this legislation this time around. Like Leslie, my family have been fighting for this bill to pass for the last 2, or actually more than 2 years at this point in time. On average, my husband calls at the very least 4 times a day. The current cost of a 20-minute call from Securus is $2.58 for local calls. We also have to pay a $3 fee to add money to the phone. For the month of November, I spent a total of $442.92. And for the month of December, I spent a total of $308.88 on phone calls. So that means in just 2 months, I spent $751.80 on calls. I'm currently a Sprint customer, and with 2 active lines on my account, I only spent $87 a month. That $87 covers unlimited calls, not 20-minute calls. The cost of these calls is not sustainable and places a heavy burden on my family and many other families. The DOC has the capacity to provide free calls to all families, as we've seen this provided at a very limited free call service momentarily at the start of the pandemic. This is not something that is out of reach for the DOC. It is unfortunate that the DOC has become so powerful that it continues to go untouched without oversight or accountability, and families continue to be impacted negatively by it. With the current cost of these calls, families are being forced to fly with one wing. This year, I urge you all to take a step back and think about the why behind the office that you hold and what your position should truly mean to people like me. Ask yourself, are you truly standing up and passing legislation to protect everyday people like me and my family? Or are you only in this for the next come up and advancement in your career? And if you truly are for the people, then be for the people and pass this legislation respectfully. Thank you for your time.
Nia, thank you. You have undertaken heroic efforts and made a lot of sacrifice to stay in touch with your husband and to keep Tank in touch with his father. And it should not be that way. You should not have to make those sacrifices. And I really appreciate your laying that out for all of us here and your activism to help get this passed. And for those of you who haven't seen Tank testify, you are in for something when you see him in action, which you will someday. Our final speaker is Bianca Tylek, Executive Director of Worth Rises, and as Representative Tyler noted, a real national expert on prison telecommunications. Under her leadership, Worth Rises has moved Connecticut, New York City, San Francisco, and other jurisdictions to provide free prison and jail communications. They have done it. She's going to explain how easy it will be for us to do it. We're delighted to have Worth Rises support in Massachusetts and to have her with us today. Thanks, Bianca.
Thank you so much, Bonnie. Thank you to Rep. Creem and Senator Creem and Rep. Tyler for having us for their championship on this bill. And thank you to Nia and Leslie for sharing your powerful and vulnerable personal stories around this issue. Thank you, Bonnie, for the introduction, for your great partnership over the years. As folks have noted, we've been fighting for this bill for quite some time, and I think this is the year it's really time that it passes. This has been an absolutely imperative issue for so many families, as you have heard today. And because of the lingering lasting impact of COVID, it is consistently a more and more important issue. So I want to take a step back and talk a little bit about the broader prison industry, the impacts, the fiscal impacts of the bills in Massachusetts and the broader national landscape. So prison telecom is a $1.4 billion industry. I want to be very clear that this is a business. First and foremost, it's not about connecting families. It's about wealth and building wealth for a few. It's an industry that's actually dominated 90% of it by just 3 companies, 80% of it by just 2 companies, really that have exorbitant margins. They, in some places, charge as much as $1 a minute, in Massachusetts, as much as 14 cents a minute, which may on a permanent basis seem not like a lot, but as the numbers that Nia and Leslie recited, can be really taxing on families, and particularly families of low income, families with fixed income, and families that are just trying to make it by, that are often also disproportionately represented in the prison population. As a result, 1 in 3 families with a loved one in prison goes into debt over the cost of calls and visits. That's 1 in 3. That is a massive number of families in Massachusetts, and 87% of those carrying that burden are women, as you see and you heard today, largely women of color. So what does that mean? That means this is not just a criminal justice issue. It's not just a racial justice issue. It's also an economic justice issue, a gender justice issue. It comes at the intersection of so many social justice issues that we know you all espouse to care for. In Massachusetts, as was mentioned earlier by Rep. Tyler, families have historically spent as much as $25 million with fees and taxes on top of that 16 she mentioned, just to talk to their loved ones. $25 million is an incredible amount of money for communities that don't have it. Going forward, thanks to some changes in contracts in the last year, we expect that this bill to make phone calls free would save families roughly $14.4 million a year. Again, a massive amount for the families here in Massachusetts. Importantly, take that 14.4 number and then contrast it with this. It would cost us $8.2 million to get this done. $8.2 million, again, there may be a fiscal note floating around with slightly different numbers, and that's because that was prior to some of the changes that just happened in the contracts. But with the recent changes, we anticipate that we're talking about $8.2 million. To be specific, that is $4.8 million in loss of commissions. We know that this has been a big conversation about the commissions, and Senator Creem mentioned it, that are being paid to sheriffs off the backs of families. Let's be very clear. It is families' money that is being taken and given to the sheriff's agencies. 4.8 million from that loss of revenue, and the actual cost of service, the actual cost to provide entirely free and access to calls and communication throughout the DOC and all correctional facilities in the state, just $3.4 million. And I want you to think about that figure when you go back and you consider the budget request of the DOC. The DOC and the various correctional agencies that we know, despite a population that has continued to decline, continues to increase. And that massive number that they continue to request is there $8.2 million in there, right? Or is that in the legislature's ability to get done? One or the other, it's absolutely necessary now. It's important to note there will be an amendment on this bill specifically to guarantee 90 minutes of call time a day. And I want to be clear when we say that. We don't actually expect people to use the phone 90 minutes a day. But as you heard from some of the videos and from the women that spoke today, there are days when communication is just more necessary than others. There are days when your father dies and you really need that phone call, and that, you know, a few minutes, 15 minutes, 30 minutes is just not enough. And there are other days where they may not be used to the same degree. And in fact, because we've done this work all over the country, we do know what that actual average number is, and it's just 30 minutes. Most people who are incarcerated use 30 minutes per day, but we know that we need to a lot more just in the case of emergencies that happen to humans like all of us. That said, as Bonnie noted, we have done this all over the country. We passed the first piece of legislation to make phone calls entirely free in New York City back in 2018. And that bill saved directly impacted families in the city of New York, roughly $10 million, and increased communication by almost 40% overnight. That many people were being disconnected because of the simple cost of a phone call. And so with that, that became the new normal. And it's important to know, and I want to read the words of the actual Department of Corrections, the Board of Corrections in New York City. After there were rumors in other states that this had caused a ruckus, they specifically responded in the words of the chair of the Board of Corrections. We are unaware of any such ruckus. Providing free telephone service to people in custody is a humane and positive way to connect people in custody with their families and communities. By contrast, not providing free calls may give rise to isolation, jealousy, and abusive access to telephone calls, all of which endanger people in custody and correctional staff. That comes from the words of correctional people who have done this already. And in fact, after New York City, we were able to support San Francisco in getting there as well, Los Angeles, San Diego, and most recently, the entire state of Connecticut, as mentioned. Connecticut will be moving fully to free phone calls along the lines of the same model legislation that's being used in Massachusetts, with a 90-minute per day threshold, and protecting visits from replacement with technology. Throughout all those campaigns, we've been able to save directly impacted people around the country $50 million a year. And the question is, can we add Massachusetts to that growing list of states, counties, localities that have done this? And in fact, I do want to note that currently the entire federal prison system in the United States has free phone calls for the last year and a half. So this is not a new thing, but it is a increasingly novel idea that specifically is meant to protect our families, protect our communities from exploitation, and as Senator Creem said, from a regressive tax really levied only on those with the least amount of means, to support a agency that it is really on the state to ensure has the budget for its own operations. So as we said, this can be done. It is not particularly expensive. It will save millions for families who really need that money in their pockets. It has an incredible impact on reentry success, on trauma for children like Tank, and for families. And importantly, it also has a great impact on correctional officers in improving the environment inside of prisons and jails by improving hope. And I like to say, there's nothing that really can pierce the tension of a prison environment like the sound of a child's voice. And those are the things that we really need to remember so that we can protect and do the best for our entire community. And lastly, I'll just say that this is something that can 100% without any doubt be implemented smoothly and without event. We often, hear concerns about this, and what we know is that we have done this now time and time again. And as an organization that works on these policies nationally, we also don't walk away when the policy has passed. We will help Massachusetts, like we have every other jurisdiction, get to implementation. We will connect the DOCs and the sheriffs to the sheriffs and the DOCs that have done this in other places, and we will help ensure that this is done effectively and with the impact that we want to see. And with that, I will pass it back to you, Bonnie, and welcome any questions.
Thank you so much, Bianca. Personally, I, having listened to Bianca just now, I feel case closed, but other people may have questions. And I think, Leslie and Nia made the case beautifully as well. We have not had any questions in the chat. I'm wondering if anyone would like to unmute and ask a question, maybe just say so in the chat to everybody right now. Or if you don't have access to the chat, unmute and so we have a few minutes for questions. So please, I
had a question.
I see a hand up with who is that?
It's Senator Eldridge.
I think Senator Eldridge is speaking.
The spotlight's still on me. I'm sorry, Senator Eldridge, please. And then I see Norma Wassel has a question as well. Thank you, Senator Eldridge.
Sure. No, thanks, Bonnie. Thanks for moderating, and just so appreciate, in addition to the legislative sponsors, hearing from Leslie and Nia, and thank you so much to Bianca, and just reading a little bit about your founding worth rises and the victories you've had in other states. I'm just wondering if there were tipping points for elected officials to move that legislation forward, and if you would have any advice for Massachusetts legislators on that front. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Senator. It's a great question. So I will say, the most recent fight we did was in Connecticut, and so that's the one freshest in my mind. And I'll say this, I think what was really easy actually for people was getting over the commissions. I think there was full 100%, I would say, bipartisan support for the idea that these kickbacks felt really wrong, that it was essentially a extended tax, right, just on a certain group of people, and that felt like it absolutely had to go away. And I think the tipping point or the inflection point for legislators on getting, all the way to providing calls at no cost was that they realized that the majority of the actual fiscal note was those commissions, and that getting from that level to the next level was so minor. It was, the fraction of a few $1 million that, it wasn't meaningful enough to not go all the way, right? What we saw in New York City, I literally had a city council member And to be fair, New York City is a rich city, but expressly say that, you know, doing this is a rounding error in the budget of our DOC. And, you know, I saw somebody put in the numbers, the budget numbers of the DOC, I think at 1.3 billion, and ask yourself what 3 million actually means in that budget, right? What does 8 million mean in that budget? It's actually a rounding error, right? It's something that you may or may not even notice. Now, obviously it's real and we need to, you know, address it. But, you know, I think one other tipping point I will say is there was a moment in which legislators made a comment, you know, well, we have to figure out, you know, how the numbers are going to work. And there was a beautiful letter to the editor written by a mother whose son was incarcerated at the time. And she just responded, well, are you going to figure it out? Or are you going to keep leaving that task to me? Because what we know is that families like Nia's, families like Leslie's are figuring it out every single day. And they're deciding which meals to skip and which bills not to pay in order to keep that phone line going. And the question is, will legislators in the state of Massachusetts figure it out too?
Thank you so much. And my only additional question is, were there any sheriffs or prison superintendents or elected law enforcement, I guess, that were helpful in supporting your efforts in other states?
Sure. So actually the commissioner of DOC in Connecticut, we worked close with them and they supported the legislation, actually all the way till the day of the very last day of session. We were negotiating very last final words as is often done that last day. And thanks to a 15-20 minute conversation, but because we had obviously been talking for some time, the actual commissioner of the Connecticut Department of Corrections called the head of the budget committee or the appropriations committee there themselves and said, put it in, we're good with the language. So 100%, we have seen that support. There was strong bipartisan support in Connecticut. As I read the words of the Board of Corrections in New York City, we did not have strong opposition there and they did come and support. And more importantly, since then have helped other agencies make these decisions. Our partners in San Francisco, in fact, the sheriff there found the money, half of the money in their own budget without even asking the mayor to fill that gap. And so that sheriff also came and said, we're willing to do this. And we worked very closely with them to help them implement. And most recently, I'll just say the quote where I took, you know, that quote that I read about from the New York City Board of Corrections came from an article that, as I mentioned, was in reaction to a sheriff down in New Orleans who had made a ridiculous comment about knowing something about what happened in New York. And that was because he was the incumbent sheriff and the new sheriff that was running against him, you know, actually made this one of her platform items, making phone calls in Louisiana and specifically in New Orleans, you know, no cost or free. And I just want to say she recently won.
That's great. Thank you so much. Really appreciate your dedication. Thank you.
Yes, thanks. Norma Wasso has you've had your hand up for a while, and then Ivy Moody, and then I think that may be all we have time for today.
Am I unmuted?
Yes, you are.
Hi, thanks very much. I want to know if legislatures knew that the lack of money to have people make their own phone calls affects reentry. There aren't enough case managers in the DOC facilities to arrange for phone calls. And many programs like residential treatment programs require in-person phone interviews. And if the social workers or case managers don't have time, the individual is left to their own to make phone calls. We have this problem all the time. I work with the public defenders to get release plans together, and they can't make the phone call. So they can't do that. And sometimes people don't go through the intake process and don't have the programs they need to go in the community. So I wanted to make sure that's not just keeping in touch with family or friends. It really negatively impacts their ability to have resources and have a successful reentry, because there's not enough staff to do that, to put people on phone calls for those particular services. So I was wondering if the legislators knew that.
I would just say I personally, not exactly. So thank you, Norma. And I think that's another piece we should add to the case. Thank you.
Yes, I can add on to that. That's a very a real thing. Obviously, we have a lot of folks that are, they don't go directly home to their homes or to their families from prison. There's sometimes transitional steps that they take in different pre-release centers as they're on their way or as they're on their way home. And I worked in one of those pre-release centers for a very long time, and so that's definitely an item. I'm gonna echo what Senator Edra said that we can take up. And thank you so much for bringing up that issue topic.
Thank you. Ivy Moody.
Yes, thank you. And I just want to thank everyone for working on this important issue. I am a former public defender, and I was just wondering if there was accounting for the recording and storage of these phone calls. I know it happens more pre-disposition, but has there been any pushback on the cost of storing all of the phone calls and accessing them? And I just wanted to get an idea if that's been brought up at all and if that's going to impact the budgeting.
Yeah, I'm happy to respond to that quickly. Thank you, Ivy, for the question. It's something very important to bring up, which is that the analysis that's been done, the cost of these calls, and not a single other place that's ever done this has ever lost any part of the security and surveillance structure of these calls. And I'm going to build on that, Ivy, because I think I know where you might be going, but I do want to say, because I think that's important. There's always concerns. Well, what about all these other, important services? They don't go away because you cover this, and the actual cost that we shared is the cost, including all of those features that already exist. And that, should the state essentially want them to continue to exist as we imagine it would. New York did it the same way, Connecticut the same way, San Francisco the same way. Everyone still has those same security and surveillance features. That said, the actual recording or the actual storage of calls is strangely the most expensive part of the call. Depending on how long that's stored for, we have learned. So if that's stored for 30 days, 6 months, 12 months, that tends to be a very costly part of the the actual service. And so we know that if that was, if the institution wanted to reduce that, that could also save additional money. But again, we're talking about a few $1 million, which I think in the grand scheme of things, whether you reduce it or not, is probably not going to be the major kicker here.
Thank you. We are now coming in on 5 o'clock, and there are no other hands raised. So I want to thank everyone, our speakers, our sponsors, the organizers in the Criminal Justice Reform Caucus. We circulated resources with the invitation to this, and I think we can resend that to participants and others with a lot of good resources, and we can forward that video that we played as well. We hope that anyone who wants to get active on this issue can please reach out to me at Prisoners Legal Services. We'll bring you in on the coalition's work. At one point, I think there were over 120 participants, still over 100. So really appreciate everybody showing up and supporting this. And I am going to send it back to Senator Eldridge with thanks again for his leadership on so many issues that regarding incarcerated people and others trapped in the criminal legal system.
Great. Thank you so much, Bonnie. Thank you for moderating. And a special thank you to the presenters and, of course, Senator Creem and Representative Tyler. And I would just say, in the past 2 years, I think because of all this advocacy, the no cost calls bill has really gone from being seen as a somewhat controversial bill or difficult to manage, at least politically, to really a political no-brainer, really about common sense and one that is really attainable in the legislature this session. So that the Criminal Justice Reform Caucus, chaired, of course, by myself and Representative Keefe, this is one of our top priorities. And so between now and the July 31st session, with Bianca noting often what happens in the last day of the session, really hope we can get this bill passed. So thank you so much for all the advocates. The Criminal Justice Reform Caucus continues to have one of the highest attendance of any briefings of any caucus. So I think it's important to realize that post 2018 criminal justice reform package, there is so much more work to be done, so much more dedication to bring dignity and more support for incarcerated people and their loved ones. So thanks everyone for attending. Have a great night, and please advocate with your legislators to pass the no cost calls bill. Have a good night.